Melissa Ivicic speaks about using a playlist in an individual rotation. She has items on her playlist that are must-dos and are a top priority for students' independent learning time. She also adds high-motivation can-do items for when they complete their must-dos. In this video, Melissa explains what routines she has in place in class as students develop a greater capacity for independent learning. What if they're in doing their independent playlist or their must-dos or their can-dos, and you're with a group of students and they are stuck? What supports do they have to work through what you've given them independently?
So, okay, a couple different things. So they have stopping points, right? So they have stopping points to make sure that they're doing certain things right. So like say for instance, it was an activity where they would first have to read the story and take notes on what they were reading or something like that. They had to do certain things, but I would have either modeled that in class already. I would have done a video of it, and they also would have been able to ask classmates that I know know how to do that to help them as well. So like if they could get through all those three things and they still are having difficulty, I would want them to come to me and I would be able to help them.
How would they request help from you? How would they let you know, I'm stuck, I need help?
So when I got really good at it, we actually had a place on the board where they could put like their name, and then they could write down what the thing is that they were having difficulty with. That's another way to see that if a kid put their name on the board and they were having difficulty with a can do and they hadn't done their must do's, I could be like, why are we even working on this right now? Because you haven't even done these things first to get to that point. So it's a good way for me to also gauge like where my kids were in terms of being accountable and being like, hey, you haven't done your must do's, so you shouldn't even have questions about this yet. So I would have a checklist. I would have a list on the board of kids, and it was usually after they had exhausted all three of those options. And a lot of times they would write their name on the board without exhausting those three options. But eventually the kids got really good about problem solving, and they got really good about understanding, okay, I need to try this, then I need to do this. And then if all else fails, I can ask a classmate. And then if all those fail, then I can write my name on the board and get help from a cyber check.
Did you explicitly teach kind of that process, or did that just kind of grow organically
So
out of?
a little bit of both, right? So I had already had some things in place in my classroom. So we had already kind of, when you have management in your classroom already, some of those things kind of just already are in place. Like you have expectations of things, that you're not allowed to interrupt my table and things like that. So when blended learning came along and I started to have kids doing that, it just carried over because it's the same rules apply, whether they were doing table work or they were doing playlist work. You weren't allowed to interrupt unless you did these things. So that did kind of already was in place, but it did kind of grow because they got better and better at it, right? So the more they had the option to problem solve and figure out for themselves, the more the less help they needed. And so they kind of started to begin to see, oh, I have the problem solving skills myself to figure this out. I don't actually need Miss Ivicic to help me. And so, like with anything, with your own children or, my kids at home, eventually these skills just start to be something that they acquire because they're practicing it often. And so my kids in my classroom eventually acquired the skills on their own because we did it so often. I mean, it was amazing because like sometimes I would give them a program that we had maybe done like once, maybe twice. And by the end of it, I could let them go because they were used to doing it because we tried new things, we did things, we problem solved and worked through them. And by modeling them and showing them, they eventually just picked it up. And so I could give them something one day and the next day I could be like, hey, like a Padlet. When I first introduced a Padlet many, many years ago, I was like, there's no way they're going to be able to do this on their own if I added it to like a playlist or something. And sure enough, they were able to do it pretty quickly.